I guess I'm the dude that gets to follow Vinay. So this is probably going to suck. My name is John Lilic, and I work for a company called ConsenSys, same company as Vinay. And specifically, I guess for the next 15 minutes or so, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the enterprise world and maybe why that's relevant. And so just a quick overview, a little bit of context. At ConsenSys, we basically do two things. We build products and we deliver services. So we have a professional services group. And I think there was a gentleman from Accenture here earlier. There's probably people from PwC, Deloitte, other places. And so basically what we do is we've built a sort of blockchain competency, if you will, across the business consulting landscape. And in the course of doing so, we've had some really interesting interactions with a lot of big companies. And so maybe today I'll just share some insights from interacting with those groups. And maybe also just, I just want to show a few slides here, just so we can have some foundational kind of thinking in place as far as the utility of all of this and whether or not it's actually applicable in a business context. Because not all, basically the blockchain isn't some magic solution that you sprinkle on everything and, you know, everything works. There are some sort of core components you want to look at from an enterprise perspective, and so this is just a quick overview. I think you guys have probably seen something along this lines, but mainly the thing that's of interest is really the smart contracts and automating business processes. It's unclear whether or not many large institutions will actually implement the blockchain, but a lot of them are sort of experimenting at the moment. I was also going to show you, but my internet's not working. If you like go to Google and you click blockchain and you click news, you're going to see lots and lots of stuff, whether it's banks, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's IBM, etc. And so there's certainly, at least in the enterprise space, a lot of discussion about it lately. So this is just really from, let's say, a financial services perspective, why you would want to think about the blockchain, or what efficiencies it can sort of add. And this is kind of boring stuff, but it can definitely reduce costs and it can definitely potentially unlock new forms of value. And also from a risk reduction standpoint, there's potential to engineer a lot of risk. And Vinay has often described about insurable risk and, you know, having sort of open platforms where multiple participants can basically participate. This is less interesting, but maybe I'll just show this real quick too. This is from a bank perspective. Really, why the blockchain is useful, and you want to kind of look at that from basically an operational product supremacy and customer intimacy standpoint, and then sort of running the bank, growing the bank, and transforming the bank. What within that context, where the blockchain can potentially be useful. So this is kind of some of the frameworks that we use when we talk to banks and try to describe this stuff to them, etc. I won't go into too many more slides. I guess the other thing I kind of wanted to talk about was, I guess many of you have heard or potentially have heard about R3 and some of these banks and like lots of financial institutions looking at the blockchain. And perhaps that's the first enterprise sort of sector that's interested in this stuff, because a lot of the use cases are pretty obvious. But one of the things that's happening lately is other sectors are moving into the space, specifically energy. I personally have an energy markets background, and I think the energy industry is like the biggest sort of potential sector for all of this stuff. And I just wanted to kind of describe a couple viewpoints there. There's a project that I worked on at ConsenSys called the Transactive Grid. And prior to coming to ConsenSys, I used to build microgrids in Brooklyn. And so basically what's happening is the cost of solar has reached price parity with the cost of coal, because basically in China they just decided to build a whole bunch of solar. And so the cost has dramatically decreased. And what we're seeing is people adopting and basically installing solar panels. Battery tech has increased as well. And so the net result is the physical infrastructure of the grid is actually decentralizing. In the historical context, you'd have a power producer and then customers, and that was pretty much it. Now the customers themselves prosumers, so now they have generative capacity, they're prosumers, can actually produce a surplus, so they generate more than what they need. And then what happens to those electrons? Who gets to sell the surplus? That's where the utility of these systems is extremely powerful. So the banking stuff is kind of boring. The energy stuff is cool. And so what the transactive grid did, and what our thinking sort of describes, is basically each facility, each house that has solar panels installed has a smart meter that calculates how much you produce and how much you consume, and that smart meter is effectively an oracle. So we, for sort of our purposes, are treating it as a source of truth, and the information coming out of that oracle we can then represent with digital assets, digital tokens. And so if you overproduce, we can represent that with digital tokens, which you can then trade on. Now, in the context of New York City, or New York State, which is where I'm from, this is very disruptive because basically New York has the oldest monopoly kind of still existing in the world, which is Con Edison, the utility. And what they do, and what many other utilities do, is they give you a wholesale rate as a prosumer. So whatever you overproduce, they give you a credit on your bill for the times that you consume from the grid. And that credit is at a wholesale rate, but then they then sell the electrons at a retail rate. So you kind of get screwed. And what we've done is we've enabled people, consumers, to have a choice. They can choose to buy from their neighbor and basically buy their tokens representing their production. And the reason you'd want to do that is because, well, you get to localize the environmental and economic benefit of the renewable energy that's produced in your community. And so that's kind of one place to think about, is really what happens as the physical infrastructure of the grid decentralizes. What type of new business logic layers can we build on top of it? And in that context, having these properties is very useful. There's another kind of thing I want to highlight, I guess, since we're talking about future stuff with Vinay earlier. And this is maybe a little bit of a silly example, but it kind of illustrates the point. Another potential use case for smart contracts is really optimizing grid conditions. And so basically the utility has to meet the demand, and no matter what. And oftentimes there's surges in demand, and sometimes those surges are predictable. For example, in England, at predictable times, the grid spikes because people turn their kettle on for tea time. And so the utility has two choices. One, it can build a new substation, at $1 billion, or two, it can incentivize the market to take more rational sort of action. And typically those incentive schemes are like rebates or some type of subsidy, etc. But in an IoT connected world, you could have a scenario where the tea kettle can communicate with the utility, and the utility can say, hey, John's tea kettle, if you don't turn on between 8 and 9 in the morning at this peak time, I will send you some tokens. Basically, this is the notion of negawatts or flexiwatts. So the absence of consumption or shifting your consumption is valuable to the utility, and they can incentivize the market in a very granular way to basically optimize grid conditions. And again, these 4 properties are extremely elegant for describing that business process. And fundamentally, the reason for that is because when you have a disparate grid, and this applies to any sector really, when you have a disparate grid with multiple owners and operators, you have a question of agency, like who is who. And so identity is kind of the foundational thing to think about here. And what the blockchain does is it is basically a single source of ubiquitous absolute truth, which we can reference and ascertain identity. And now that we can kind of do that, it makes it a lot easier to credibly think about how to sort of incentivize the market and how to interact with the market with these kinds of mechanisms. And so that's another kind of use case, or I guess sector, that I really wanted to describe here as well, and hopefully get people thinking beyond just banking. There's others as well. More recently, we've started interacting with a lot of supply chain kind of management organizations. And so if you can imagine, as a consumer in the future, being able to see the provenance of the product that you are purchasing at every step of the manufacturing process. And the reason that's potentially interesting is because, for example, in Brazil they have a booming Tinder. I'm sorry, not Tinder. I was on Tinder earlier. Timber market, wood, like timber market. If you want really fancy hardwood floors, Brazil's a great place to source the wood, basically. And there is obviously a tremendous need to ensure that industry functions in a sort of sustainable way, and they've got systems in place where effectively the government kind of, or some authority locally, issues a certificate saying, hey, this timber is legally sort of sourced from a renewable or a sustainable place, when in fact that's just like totally really a very corrupt system that doesn't work very well at all. And so as a customer, oftentimes you might purchase, and I don't mean to just like crap on Brazil here, this is very, very sort of common in many geographies around the world, but you end up purchasing the end product and either it's of an inferior quality, or worse, it comes from just like a very unsustainable source. And the reason why as a consumer you're not as informed prior to making that purchase is because you're trusting that certificate that the local authority issued saying, hey, this is all good. And so in the context of the blockchain, again, with these 4 properties, what you can do is at every step of the way, as that product is manufactured, there could be some attestation made, basically describing where it is in the manufacturing process. And that attestation can be sort of cryptographically signed against, let's say, the identity of the product. And then it just becomes a question of who is making the attestations and are they trusted. And again, this is where identity and reputation and having this single source of truth becomes useful, because now the attestation service, you can imagine, becomes possibly a lucrative business. And so I guess in a broader context, you could also imagine pharmaceuticals. And where does the drug that you're taking actually come from? What steps has it gone through? Are you really trusting Bayer? And maybe you should trust it because maybe they're a great company, but these are the kinds of questions that I think from a supply chain standpoint people are going to start thinking about. And then again, just going back to these kind of foundational components, I think for all of you or many of you that are professionals in the wild, whether you work at large institutions or have a small business, when you start thinking about the blockchain in the context of your business processes, this is really the first place to start.